Thank you. It's an honor to be here. It's been an amazing couple days thus far, even though I just arrived yesterday. Last night had an amazing dinner. So many different things. Who was at the dinner last night? Raise your hand. Yeah, awesome. Really good stuff, and you'll see a lot of that today. We talked a little bit about plant medicines. But today we're going to dive into emerging ketogenic inventions for performance, longevity, and overall health. So just as a baseline, who's heard of a ketogenic diet? All right, cool. So this is great. So this is how I know this crowd is really progressive. And I love that because a lot of times you'll give a talk and people will be like, oh, that ketoacidosis thing, like they kind of freak out about it. But you guys are obviously very progressive and hopefully going to learn something new about some of the new research and things that we're working on in our lab. And so I had to get this out of the way. I know I'm from the U.S., but I had to get the A out of the way because I know we're in Canada. So I was going to get stuck on that the entire presentation, but I had to get it out in the beginning. So here's a little overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to do a little background, show you a little bit of our laboratory in Tampa, Florida, some of the work that we do. Very luckily, you guys know a lot about keto already. Very little on the basics. Talk a little bit about performance. It's one of the biggest questions that most people have is, can you perform well on a well-formulated, and that's very important, ketogenic diet. A little bit about anti-aging. We heard some talks this morning about that. There's some components that I'd like to touch on as well, and emerging research and areas of focus. So to start, this is where my journey began. Back in 2002, this is what was read on my grandmother's autopsy report. Just said an obese woman in moderate to severe respiratory distress, lethargic. And to me, like I was very young, I was in middle school at the time, and that didn't sit well with me. And it was very painstaking, and she was like the rock of our entire family. She was the one that held us all together. And unexpectedly, we got a phone call. She was rushed to the hospital. She was fine, just saw her like a couple days before, rushed to the hospital, died the next day. Out of nowhere, and this is how they classified her. And to me, that wasn't acceptable. I was like, so many emotions. I was frustrated, upset, mad at the system. And I was like, why didn't someone help her? Like, yeah, she had trouble with weight her entire life. Yeah, she smoked and she had all these complications. But I looked at this and said, the system failed. And so I sat there young and I said, I have two options. I can go to the traditional system, right? I could be there and sit on the sideline and complain and be like, those days suck. This is horrible. What's going on? We talked a little bit about the food pyramid. Like, no one's there to help her. Why is this a problem? Or you can actually be the change. And so that's what we set out to do. And from a very early age, that's what I set out to do, is really come up with innovative and alternative solutions, just like many of you here. So we created something in Tampa, Florida called the Applied Science and Performance Institute. So I spent several years in academia, teaching, doing research, and that's really where we got our start. So I went to the University of Tampa, played baseball there for several years, won a national championship, and was super interested in how to optimize my body composition, but also still had that recollection of like, yeah, it may be easier for me to handle a lot of carbohydrates while I'm playing sports, but 99% of the population can't, just like my grandmother. So I wanted to figure out how to research more of those areas. So I met my business partner, Dr. Jacob Wilson there, and we really were, both of us were athletes. He played hockey, I played baseball, turned scientist. And so we've published and presented all over the world on various different topics. To date, have over 150 papers, abstracts, and book chapters on a variety of different topics, everything from blood flow restriction training to supplementation to ketogenic diets. And so this is a big passion of ours, of spreading this message and spreading this conversation throughout the world as much as possible. And so our goal was to do this, to change the world by taking what was accessible to 1% and giving it to the other 99%. And what I mean by that is when you do research, there's so much incredible research that's being done in labs right now that it won't get out for another 10 years. One is because scientists like to talk in these complex terms that most people are, it's like, whoo, way over your head. And it just doesn't, and if it's not applicable, what is the purpose of it? So how do we take some of this amazing research that's being done and make sure that people in the field, biohackers, can take this and implement it and see a change? So that's when we created the Applied Science and Performance Institute. And so I want to show you guys a little bit, I want to show you a little insight into what our laboratory looks like. So that's a little bit of ASPI, and you guys kind of saw the entire spectrum of the individuals we work with, all the way from elite athletes to people with neurological disorders. And we'll touch on both of those spectrums today. So first and foremost, this is the question. I wanted to bring up this. I think this is a big term in Canada, a kerfuffle. It's like a fight that breaks out, but I don't want to put the blame on any one thing, right? It's easy to say it was this, or it was that, or point fingers. But in essence, at the end of the day, we're facing an epidemic, right? Especially in the US. You guys, Canada's a little bit better off than we are. It's tough to see, but US leads the obesity epidemic by far, right? Been number one, continue to be number one. And what's even scarier, and you just heard an incredible talk by Dr. Jason Fung, what's even scarier is that we're using the term type 2 diabetes now when it used to be called adult onset diabetes. That's even scarier because that means kids are starting to develop something that, like he talked about, is certainly preventable and curable. So we're facing a challenge. The question becomes, how do we get from here to this, right? And it ultimately is that. And we can put the blame on this man and the whole Ansel Keys thing. And we certainly have had a lot of trials and tribulations getting to this point, but this is at least promising that we've made progression and now we're back to kind of like, hey, butter's back and it's okay. So this is one of my favorite things. At least the low-fat paradigm hopefully is long gone and for the right reasons. You guys know this, so I won't touch on this very much, but obviously there was a lot done back in the early 1950s that caused a lot of complications. Correlational data was presented as causation. And the biggest thing, you guys know this, is that correlation does not equal causation. Just because, like if you look at Tampa, where I'm from, if you look at ice cream sales are up in the summer. What else is up in the summer? Murder rates are up in the summer. People are hot, they're frustrated, people tend to cause more complication. Does that mean that ice cream causes you to become a murderer? No, right? I actually think it tends to be the opposite, right? You eat some ice cream, you're happy. Doesn't happen. So we need to stop taking correlation and relating it to causation. And so that's kind of initiated this whole low-fat paradigm. There are some correlations that higher fat intake, saturated fats, caused a lot of these complications. That's been debunked. I think everyone here is well on board with that. So the first question is this: can you gain muscle on a ketogenic diet? You guys know what constitutes, in premise, a ketogenic diet. This is one of the biggest questions that we faced back when we first started investigating this. And you'll hear tomorrow, I believe it's tomorrow, from one of our good friends and colleagues, Dr. Jeff Volek, who's done a lot of this pioneer work. And this is actually data from his lab, where you see, obviously, a ketogenic diet, low carb plus resistance training, has a ton of benefits for body fat loss, right? That's great. But the question still comes up is, what about muscle mass? So we were one of the first ones, and you see this all the time. People on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, they're like, oh, it's impossible. You need insulin, you need this. So we're like, all right, cool. Like, why don't we put this to the test? So this is a paper we just published. We took 25 resistance-trained males, put them on either a high carb or a ketogenic diet, matched for protein, which is something that is often missing in the literature, is that we match them for protein. So that way people can say it was a higher protein intake that was the result of this. Adapted them for 2 weeks and then put them on an 8-week-long ketogenic diet. So here's blood ketone levels. You see here at the top, this is the ketogenic dieting group. Their ketone levels were kind of elevated. We measured blood ketones throughout the entire study. On the bottom's a Western diet, exactly what you would expect. So here's what we found. You look at lean body mass. Both groups at the end of the intervention gained the same amount. They were training hard, 3 times a week, full body programs, like really hard workouts. These guys were squatting and deadlifting on average like 2 to 2.5 times their body weight. You look at fat mass, and the ketogenic diet group lost significantly more fat mass than the Western diet group. So kind of this body recomposition going on. You're gaining muscle, losing fat mass. So we basically showed it was possible, and it is possible on a well-formulated ketogenic diet, even when protein is controlled and matched for, you can gain muscle. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why that's the case. Here's some of the things. No significant differences in strength. We actually saw, which was pretty interesting, a significant increase in testosterone in the ketogenic dieting group, which is expected. You're eating a higher amount of fat. And we actually saw no differences in cholesterol or triglycerides between the groups. Here's one of the things we want to point at. We want to look at mechanisms. So why is this possible, right? Because people are going to question it. Well, it's impossible. You don't have insulin to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Well, the interesting part about this is that ketones themselves seem to be anabolic in nature. This was a study we did in animals where we basically did a standard diet, a ketogenic diet, or a ketogenic diet, and then added ketones on top of that. And we looked at muscle protein synthesis, which is like the trigger for building muscle, and we saw that the group that had the highest amount of ketones triggered muscle growth to the greatest extent. So that could be one of the mechanisms that's at play. One of the other things that we also know about ketones, this was a study that was done where they basically infused ketones. This was done early on. And they saw that leucine breakdown. Leucine is one of the primary amino acids that's responsible for muscle growth. Leucine breakdown was inhibited or decreased by 18 to 40% when ketones were elevated in the blood. So you're preventing a very important amino acid from being broken down. And so this is kind of a little depiction. Like ketones seem to spare important amino acids like leucine. So we did an animal study, which I'll show you a little bit later on, where we basically took animals, fed them a ketogenic diet for a very long period of time. And this is one of the things that we also found, is that a lot of times people are concerned, oh, my muscle's just gonna waste away, or it's gonna start breaking down protein. The incredible things about our bodies is that it recognizes certain amino acids like alanine are very glucogenic, meaning they're very easily converted over into glucose. Whereas things like BCAAs and leucine are very important for muscle. Alanine, we don't need, it's not as important for our body composition. Well, alanine was lower in the animals that were on a ketogenic diet, whereas total branched chain amino acids and leucine weren't any different. Now, why is that important? Tomorrow, I'll let Dr. Volek talk a little bit about his data in humans, but one of the things that we found in animal models that kind of support some of his human work is that if you are adapted on a ketogenic diet, if you are adapted, your glycogen levels are no different from someone who's eating a higher carbohydrate diet. Now, this sounds crazy. You're like, how is that possible? There's several ways that I won't even go into now. This can be one of them. Alanine is being decreased and being shuttled over to being converted into glycogen. You have the triglycerides, right? Glycerol can also be converted over into glycogen. Once you're well adapted, we see both in animal models and Dr. Volek will show tomorrow in his human models, no differences in baseline glycogen levels. So you still do have glycogen. What about a cyclic ketogenic diet? Who's heard of a cyclic ketogenic diet? Okay, a lot of you. So this is one method. There's several ways that people can incorporate in a cyclic ketogenic diet. This is just one that we tested, where basically people go, hey, I'm gonna eat ketogenic Monday through Friday and then blow it out on the weekend. Like go eat pizza, fries, whatever. And so we wanted to test that. And so one of the things that we found really quick is that here's the ketogenic diet. Here's the people who were strict keto. Their ketones were elevated the entire time. Here's the ones that were cyclic. Monday, they weren't there. Tuesday, weren't there. Wednesday, they were starting to just hit about 0.3 to 0.5 millimoles. And then Friday, they're like above 0.5 millimoles, and then boom, they eat carbs on the weekend, right? So they're kind of getting in, and then fluctuating out. Well, what we found was the individuals who were on both groups lost the same amount of total mass. Right? If you think about that, they both lost 3 kilograms of total mass. Like if they stepped on a scale, they'd be like, yeah, it's a win for both groups. But we know that total mass isn't what's ideal, like isn't what we should be looking at. We need to look at the composition of that mass. Is it muscle mass? Is it fat mass? What matters? So you look at the ketogenic dieting group, and primarily all of what they lost, they were eating at a calorie deficit, was all fat mass. Whereas the cyclic ketogenic dieting group lost a little bit of fat, but what does that mean that they lost? Muscle, right? And a lot of that could be attributed to what we just talked about, was that ketones themselves are muscle sparing. And so they didn't have a high amount of ketones, so they were kind of riding this fence the entire time. So extreme periods of cyclical ketogenic diet, where you're eating keto Monday through Friday and then carbing up on the weekends, doesn't seem to be ideal. So there's different options, there's different alternatives like targeted or lesser aggressive cyclical ketogenic dieting approaches that may be beneficial for some performance athletes, but this is kind of the extreme to look at. So there's also new research coming out on CrossFit athletes. This was a study by our friend Dr. Rachel Gregory, again showing the ketogenic diet group lost a significant amount of body fat, maintained their lean mass, maintain their performance. This was another study by our colleagues out of Auburn University. Again, 3 months on a ketogenic diet, they were able to decrease a significant amount of body fat, maintain their lean mass, and maintain their performance. This is interesting. A lot of times people say, oh, what about anaerobic sports? We're like powerlifting. This study was done out of New Zealand, and they put these powerlifters, it was a couple of them, on a ketogenic diet, and they found that they lost a significant amount of fat mass, but their performance didn't decrease, which is interesting for a powerlifter or anyone who's in a sport where the weight to power or weight to strength ratio matters. It could be an interesting approach, right? If you're trying to, I don't know if any of you guys listen to like Joe Rogan or some of that stuff. He talks a lot about these MMA fighters. Behind the scenes, a lot of them are trying to do probably a poorly formulated, but they're trying to do a ketogenic diet to cut weight to make their class, but still maintain their strength and power output. Mind blown. So what makes a ketogenic diet unique? Dr. Fung talked about this, and that's why I like kind of the approaches coming together. Like, I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting, along with a ketogenic diet. You're getting this elevation in ketones. So let's dive a little bit into these ketone bodies and some of the emerging research that we're doing and that others have done. So what are exogenous ketones, right? Your body can produce its own endogenously. Exogenous means oral consumption, right? Outside of the body consumption. And so typically your liver produces these ketones. When you're on a ketogenic diet, they get produced and circulated throughout your entire body. What we're gonna talk about a little bit is what about if you were to deliver these via supplementation? So there's different types that are out in the market now. This is just a general overview. that each have their own characteristics, right? There's a lot of research on the ketone esters. Ketone esters was done very early on in the 90s. They can elevate ketones significantly. One of the challenges, and unfortunately I've been a guinea pig of a lot of this, is it tastes, I think I made it too light. Rubbing alcohol is nice. It's rough. It is rough stuff to consume, but it elevates your ketones fairly significantly. It's very expensive, extremely expensive. So there's those, and then there's ketone salts, which are readily available on the market now. They're better tasting, depending upon where, there's so many now that are out there. So one of the cons that people have is they're worried about the salt load. However, people that are on a well-formulated ketogenic diet likely need more sodium, magnesium, calcium, things like that. And there's only one company that utilizes the actual R isomer, which is the effective isomer that your cells can actually take up and utilize. And that's proven. And so those are some pros and cons of each of the ketone ester and the ketone salts. So are ketones a magic potion? No, certainly not. And that's one of the things I want to get across is, like, a lot of times people are like, what are these things? They get skeptical about it. I think they're absolutely synergistic with the diet itself. And we'll talk about that. And here's 3 main reasons why. Ketones themselves are an alternative superior fuel source than glucose. And they're absolutely superior on a delta ATP level. Signaling properties that are important for body composition, and signaling properties that may be important for overall health and longevity. And we'll talk about each one of some data for each one of those. So here's a study looking at cognitive function and performance. And so yes, it was in animals, but they basically fed them a ketone ester for 5 days, just 5 days. And these animals were running on a treadmill, and here's what they found. They ran further, so they basically matched for calories, and then they just gave one extra ketones via this ester. They were able to run further, so there's some data now pointing to increased endurance performance. And this is where I'm certainly more interested, is that their number of correct decisions, so their cognitive performance after the run was definitely improved. Think about, if this would translate over into humans, think about like military, right? Who have to go out, run. They might have to be in some type of atmosphere where they're not eating very frequently. They're going, and then they have to hit a target that's this big. Cognitive performance becomes a matter of life or death at that point. That's really interesting kind of pilot work to lead up into some of the work that is being done now in the military. Brown fat. Who's heard of brown fat? Yeah, y'all. I feel like I'm freezing in here. I feel like I'm creating some brown fat right now. So brown fat's the type of fat that we want, right? It has more mitochondria inside of it versus like white fat, which you see a lot of people walking around with. Not here, but in the US and all over, it's just, most people have white fat. What we want is brown fat, increased mitochondria. So here's an interesting study that we did. We basically took animals, put them on a Western diet, a low-carb ketogenic diet, or a low-carb ketogenic diet plus exogenous ketones. And we actually saw a 41% increase in brown adipose tissue, which could be indicative of what we're gonna be talking about next, is that these animals had a lower feed efficiency, which could be very important for body composition. So feed efficiency is weight gained over calories consumed. And so I just had a discussion, or just created a video about someone who was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking with Dom D'Agostino. And the other person was saying, I don't believe that people are more or less carb tolerant. And I said, well, that's interesting, because people are more or less insulin sensitive. So how are we missing the difference here? And so here's my argument, is you look at some people, and everyone knows this person, who can, and we all have a friend or family member that can eat not just a donut, they probably eat the entire box, and they'll wake up the next morning with like shredded abs. And you're like, ugh. And then you see the other person who like looks at a donut and they feel like they put on 5 pounds, right? Like people are more or less insulin sensitive. One of the reasons that could be is because of feed efficiency. And one of the things that we found here on the left is, you look at a Western diet, this is exercise plus ketones. This is a ketogenic diet, exercise plus ketones. So the ketogenic dieting group that was exercising and supplementing with exogenous ketones had the lowest feed efficiency. That means even if they were eating the same amount of food, they weren't gaining as much weight. In part, that may be explained by this. They're increasing brown adipose tissue, increasing things like thermogenesis, so burning off more calories, maybe increasing energy expenditure. This was a brand new study that just came out looking at a ketone ester reducing body weight and adiposity in obese mice. So again, kind of validating that and providing further support for that. There's more data on human performance. This was done with the ketone ester in both rowing and cycling performance. Seems to increase performance, which is very promising. And also there was a recent study, and I'm sure Dr. Volek's lab did this study, showing that, again, with ketone salts, increased time to exhaustion and increased average power. So this fuel source seems to be very unique, and a lot of benefits beyond just cognitive function and performance are being seen. Here's a brand new study done by our friends out of Augusta. It's being presented right now, is that they supplemented firefighters for 7 days. They had them do a treadmill bout with their gear on, which is pretty interesting. They found that the ketone supplemented condition, the individuals, the firefighters who were supplementing with ketones, had reduced cardiac work and increased focus during the physical activity, which again, for these guys, these heroes that are going out and fighting fires, like that's the difference between life or death. So pretty interesting stuff. One of the things that we know, it's been well established now, Dr. Mary Newport is a huge advocate of this as well, is that as we get older, our brains cannot use glucose as well. I think everyone here understands that, is that when we're young, we're running around, we're utilizing them, we're eating a bunch of candy, right? We're burning off. As we get older, our brains cannot effectively utilize glucose as well. The transporters, and this is kind of a depiction from our book, these are the MCT transporters, which transport ketones into cells. These are fine through as we age, but a lot of times the glucose transporters that transport glucose into our cells are impaired or aren't working as well. So we need to be feeding our brain with the energy that it needs. So Alzheimer's is one of those conditions. It's referred to now as type 3 diabetes. You look at these individuals and their brains cannot utilize glucose very efficiently. And that's kind of what these scans show, is that they're in an Alzheimer's patient's brain, they cannot utilize glucose as well. But you look at this study and they basically gave MCTs and in Alzheimer's patients, and you look at the higher the level of blood ketones, the greater their performance on a memory test. It's a fuel problem. There's several things that are going on, but primarily what we're seeing is that it is a fuel problem. The brain is starving for energy and we're not providing it. So how do we get there? How do we get to that point to be able to provide the brain the fuel that it actually can take up and utilize and help prevent some of the formation of amyloid plaques and things like that? What about Parkinson's? This is, again, one of the things that we think is that this is a fuel or energy deficit problem. So this is what we did a case study at our laboratory, and we have some cognitive, I don't know if you guys remember in the video, some cognitive tracking capabilities where we look at cognitive function. And so this is an individual who has Parkinson's. This is his baseline. And basically they're meant to, they're basically taking their eyes and they're tracking a circle with both of their eyes. This is before, and this is 30 minutes after giving a dose of exogenous ketones. Pretty profound, and we're seeing this over and over and over again, and we're actually about to embark on a large trial with Parkinson's patients, implementing some of these strategies to try and see if we can improve overall cognitive function. And this is another test. This is kind of similar. This is before. You can see all over the place. This is after. Just 30 minutes. Drastic improvements. This was a headline. I don't know if you guys saw this headline, like some media outlet, again, took correlational research and translated it over and said, oh, ketogenic diets will shorten your telomere, speed aging. If you want to die faster, eat a ketogenic diet, all this craziness. Before I do that, if anyone is weary, I don't know if you saw it, if anyone's weary, This is some data with animals. And so this was kind of very promising. This is one of the things that shifted my mindset was we took animals and we took them at about 25 years of human equivalent age, and we put them on a ketogenic diet their entire life and said, what happens? Let's look at them and carry it out their entire life. So I'm gonna show you a little bit of a picture of some of the different groups that we had. So this is a Western diet group. You can see here a lot of fat built around the organs that's going on here. It's typical, what you see in like a McDonald's type diet. This is a standard chow diet. So this is just a high protein, low fat, moderate carb. Not bad. This is a ketogenic diet. It looks like something out of a textbook. So very, very promising. It was interesting. The amount, they had way less fat around their organs, visceral adipose tissue. So it was very, very promising. Here we looked at the half-life. So we looked at how long, so the half-life is basically how long it takes for half of the animals in each group to die. Here's the lifespan of the Western diet group. Here's the lifespan of the Western diet group. And you see the lifespan of the ketogenic dieting group. It was nearly double. And multiple studies are coming out to now look at a ketogenic diet. Obviously in animal models, it would be difficult to do in human models, so we wouldn't be here to see it. But it's promising with some of the markers that we're looking at. And so I'm gonna wrap up and talk a little bit about some emerging areas. This is one of the areas that we're looking into big time, traumatic brain injury. You look at these athletes. We work a lot with like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and a lot of NFL athletes. The amount of data is overwhelming with these guys with traumatic brain injury. When your brain experiences some type of trauma like that, it becomes temporarily insulin resistant. And what do? These athletes get hit, they're in games, they're hit, they go over to the sideline, they chug down some glucose and ton of fructose, and their brain can't utilize it. So why do we have complications? We're wondering why 5 years after these guys are done playing, they're having all these complications with CTE. Better helmets is only a Band-Aid. It's not gonna do the trick. We need to address the root of the problem, and so we're working a lot on addressing some of the areas that we can help decrease reactive oxygen species and provide a fuel source for the brain that's neuroprotective. So that's an area of focus. I won't jump too much into this because that'll be Dr. Volek tomorrow, but doing a ton of work, just like Dr. Fung, in the type 2 diabetes area. Here's another emerging area. If you guys haven't seen Dr. Angela Poff, Dr. Thomas Seyfried, this is some of the work from Dr. Angela Poff's dissertation. So she's doing a lot with cancer. Here's the control group. Here's a ketogenic diet group. Here's a ketogenic diet plus ketone ester. Here's a ketogenic diet plus ketone ester plus hyperbaric oxygen therapy. This is metastasis of cancer cells. Pretty profound, some of the research that they're doing. Pretty profound. I highly suggest you check that out. This was a study, we did a case study. Obviously my mom's like my hero to me, she's amazing. I wanted to look at Crohn's, so highly inflammatory condition in the GI tract. And so we did a case study where we gave exogenous ketones and did light activity, walking about 10 to 15 minutes 3 times per week. And we looked at CRP. CRP is a marker of inflammation. And so the average range, so you know when I put this graph up, the average range is from like 0 to 4.5 to like 5. She was at 60. So her CRP levels were at 60. 3 months later, we got it down below 3. So pretty promising, some anti-inflammatory. So we're, again, just the beginning. There's some research now coming out with a modified ketogenic approach for people who have some of these autoimmune conditions, but something to just keep on your radar. Here's my newest subject. If some of you guys know, like this is my guy. I just got a dog, and so he's keto. One of the things we're experimenting with now that we'll have a lot more, maybe next event, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but experimenting, I've been feeding him keto. It took him a little while to adjust to a ketogenic diet himself. Kibble, if you haven't, there's a whole group called the Keto Pet Sanctuary, if you're actually interested in any of this. They're doing incredible work on this, but he's eating a ketogenic diet. He eats butter and bacon and I incorporate in vegetables, but I'm thinking about switching him to raw. That's going to be something that I'm titrating him in very soon, but we'll have some more data on that soon. And then lastly, here's our lab's current focus. Again, like I mentioned, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, stem cell therapy. We talked a little bit about that earlier. We're doing a lot of work. If you guys know Tony Robbins, I'm actually leaving here we're gonna go work with him and some of his group in Abu Dhabi, but he's a big proponent. He's been doing a lot of stem cell therapy. Our lab's doing stem cell therapy to look at performance as we age. One of the things that we think is performance goes down, obviously, as we age. How can we help regenerate and protect some of that tissue, specifically muscle tissue? So we're doing a lot of work in the stem cell therapy arena and combining it with a bunch of different interventions. And then also interested in the synergistic effects of CBD and potential ketogenic therapies. That's one of the areas that we're exploring right now, and I know that's a big area that's going to be discussed throughout this week. So key takeaways for you guys. It is possible to gain muscle on a ketogenic diet. Ketones seem to have anabolic and anti-catabolic properties. There's more research being done on CrossFit, anaerobic sports like powerlifting, things like that. Extreme cyclical ketogenic diets, like extreme Monday through Friday and then carbon up on the weekends, doesn't seem to be ideal. Ketogenic diets seem to promote longevity and factors associated with long-term health, a well-formulated ketogenic diet. Exogenous ketones seem to have a lot of potential, especially I'm very interested in the cognitive aspects, especially when it comes to things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury. And so one of the things that we do is we do a lot of education on this website called ketogenic.com. If anyone's interested in the keto world, we do a lot of recipes, free everything on ketogenic.com. We do a lot on social media, posting infographics, food, all that stuff. And at the end of the day, like a lot of times people, one of the things I'm most afraid of with the ketogenic conversation is that it's gonna become like what happened with Atkins, where people get so frustrated with it. It kind of gets this huge up and goes down. Part of the problem was that internally people were arguing, and I'm not about that. If you guys know, I'm all about like bringing people together and fostering collaboration. So this was one of the memes that one of the people on my team made for me. I don't know if you guys watched the UFC fight, but like there's a lot going on right now with carnivore, you got vegans and paleo, like people arguing. I'm just like we can all coexist. And I think there's a way that each individual person is their own, and how we optimize our diets, our lifestyles, how we provide different hacks is super individualized, and we need to be our own scientists with our own bodies. So with that being said, I appreciate your guys' time. I appreciate your guys' support, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. We had so many questions on the app.
Awesome.
And so I'm just going to go over some of these questions. One is, what would be the optimal cycling period? 3 weeks keto, 1 week off? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it depends on how well you're adapted. So if you're adapted, like if you've been on, it takes some time to become adapted. So I would say at minimum, give yourself 2 to 3 weeks in the beginning to become adapted. And then from there, you can titrate it, say, I wouldn't go an entire week off. I would go, like, if you're gonna do it, maybe a day and then kind of get back on. One of my approaches is I like to protein cycle. So once a week, I'll have a higher protein. I'll bring fat down a little bit. Carbs will still stay low, but I protein cycle rather than carb cycle. But I think that's the approach.
And what do you think about just pre-workout, a little bit of carb? Is there any detriment to that?
So pre-workout carbs, I think it's a great tool. If you're trying to optimize your workout or optimize performance, utilizing maybe 15 to 30 grams of carbs prior to your workout, utilizing carbs as an ergogenic aid rather than a necessity, I think could be a great tool. You're gonna blunt the insulin response during the workout. So that's great.
Okay, we got another one here. If someone wanted to measure the amount of bound fat as a biomarker to track progress, what method would you recommend?
It's tough. There's no method yet in humans to measure brown fat. You have to take like biopsies of the tissue. A lot of it's going to be like you can track your NEAT levels. That might be indicative of increased brown fat. It's a very rough marker, but like track how much you're like moving, your movement pattern. Your NEAT is your non-exercise activity induced thermogenesis, so like how much you're fidgeting and moving around. That can be triggered by increased amounts of brown fat.
And then the last one's kind of close to my heart. So I'm a vegan, and some people in the audience are also asking that, look, we heard and saw a lot of maize and goods and studies on mice. While there's a ton of research supporting a plant-based diet, especially for promoting longevity, like Dr. Klatz was mentioning, people are still confused. What's your thing? I know that you don't want to necessarily fight it out, but
yeah,
how do you?
I think a vegan approach can be great. I think a vegetarian approach can be great. People are carnivore. I think they're lacking some nutrients if it's not a well-formulated approach. I think there's a ton of benefits of having plants in your diet, no doubt about it. The fiber, a lot of what we talked about yesterday with plant medicine, I think it's great. If someone's going to try and do a vegan or vegetarian-based keto approach, it's going to be very big in healthy oils, utilizing things like avocado and things like that. The only thing I'd say is you need to just be more, people that are vegan or vegetarian, need to be extremely proactive with supplementation, making sure they're getting in the necessary essential amino acids that oftentimes, especially if you're eating keto, if you're not eating keto, that they're very easily attainable in the diet. But if you're eating a lower carb approach, you might need to supplement with like some fermented essential amino acids. But I think I know a lot of people, have a lot of friends that do a great job doing that.
Last question. Do you think there's a time of the year that one should do keto versus not keto? Like, do you think that there's a seasonal thing that our bodies are made for?
I think it's doable consistently. I like to maintain some degree of metabolic flexibility. So that's why I say like a well-formulated ketogenic diet. I think some people get so strict and hung up and stuck on it, and then they freak out when they're off. Like on my birthday, I'll have sushi, but like it's very different response because it's cold rice versus hot rice. Like the metabolic impact's gonna be very different. Just make sure, one of the things I caution people is that make sure you don't go keto and then have like a huge carb up, because your body can't really handle that much amount of insulin. So like going into the holidays, I'm gonna make like obviously alternatives on like, I know you guys just celebrate Thanksgiving. We have Thanksgiving coming up at the end of November, but I know like I love one of the desserts that my mom makes, and it's gonna be very difficult to make it keto. So I'm gonna probably tailor myself into just slowly increasing my carbs a little bit to be able to handle that. So I already know going into November, like I'll be able to enjoy mom's dessert.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.